thank you again for allowing me to be here today. And speaking of yard signs, it's kind of funny because on the Eastern Plains, those kinds of yard signs, after about 2 weeks in the wind, they start tilting very far. It's always to the right, though, might I add. But you have to actually break off the bottom part of the yard sign and put them into the ground so that the bottom part of the sign is flat and level with the earth so that the sign doesn't end up breaking off and blowing down the street. But I also would like to introduce Ben Albright this morning, who is with Betsy Markey's campaign. Apparently, Ben is the only Democrat who was not offered a job by Barack Obama. But I do want to start this morning with an email that I received. Actually, before I do that, I want to tell another story about my daughter. You've heard me tell stories over and over about my daughter, and I think I may have told you some of this story before. But we were at our mother and father-in-law. My mother and father-in-law live in Cheyenne Wells. They're actually now moving to Gillette, Wyoming, believe it or not. But they live in Cheyenne Wells at least for a couple more weeks, and we had gone down there a couple of weeks ago to have dinner with them. And this is Allison's first year of school, first year in kindergarten, and hopefully her only year in kindergarten, but her first year in school. But anyway, she had picked up a couple of bad habits at school, including smacking very loudly, chewing food with her mouth wide open. And so we're sitting here having a nice dinner, and I could hear her smacking, and I look at her and said, "Allison, remember your manners. You need to make sure that you're chewing with your mouth closed." And I started to say, "I'm watching you." And before I could get the words "I'm watching you" out of my mouth, she looks at me and she goes, just like that. So kids, it's amazing what they can pick up with. She's 6 years old and is already making me laugh hard enough that it's hard to enforce what we had just said. But I also want to thank Bob for the wonderful event at your home. We talk about how to win elections, and Brian mentioned, Kevin mentioned, everybody has talked about how this campaign really is unique because this is truly getting back to the very roots of our country in terms of the electoral process. Something that is going to be a door-to-door campaign, a phone call-to-phone call campaign, a Main Street to Main Street campaign, where we introduce ourselves and listen and learn and talk about the problems and the struggles facing this country. And nowhere was that more evident than in Bob's house to see 70, 80, 90 people talking about the issues confronting this country. And the only way we're going to win this race is by building additional circles, those layers and layers of circles of supporters. And so I encourage you, if you've got neighbors, friends, communities that are interested in hearing what's going on, in talking about the issues, then by all means, please let us happen. Yeah, Bob?
I don't want to interrupt you, but as long as we have a Betsy Marker worker here, a friend of mine who was an activist went to the last Betsy Markey open house or whatever it was as a constituent. They wouldn't let him in because they were afraid he was going to record something.
Really?
I invited Democrats and unaffiliated. So it's interesting to see that the Democrats want to follow you around to see if you can make a mistake that they can capitalize on. But the Markey people won't let Republicans in.
Yeah, that is interesting. Well, and again, I think that's the way we win, is by not being afraid to take our message into communities that the Republican Party has been afraid to take that message into.
Exactly.
To make sure that we're active and listening and reaching out to all the voters and all the citizens in our great state and our great country. But I want to share with you a little email that I got, and I received this email from an organization. I don't remember which think tank put this out, but it's an email that talks about some of the spending issues facing this country. And it goes on and starts like this. This morning, White House Chief, this was sent about a week or two ago. This morning, White House Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel and Budget Director Peter Orszag will release a memo directing all federal agency heads to develop plans to cut at least 5% from their budgets by identifying programs that do little to advance their missions or President Obama's agenda. It goes on to say, this spasm of fiscal responsibility can only mean one thing. The Obama administration is about to go on another wild spending spree. And sure enough, Politico reports that while Blue Dogs in the House managed to whittle what was a $200 billion jobs bills down to $146 billion last month, the Senate is now larding it back up again with a $24 billion Medicaid bailout and a $23 billion teachers union bailout. Spending is going to be one of the most fundamentally important aspects of this campaign. It ties directly into the economy, what's happening as a country, creating jobs, getting our country back on track, both economically, but we have to get our country back on track fiscally as well. The Spend Now, Cut Later Act has become a staple for the Obama administration, the email goes on to say. In February 2009, after signing the largest single-year increase in domestic federal spending since World War II, President Obama held a fiscal responsibility summit designed to send a signal that we are serious about putting the nation on sounder financial footing. Then in June 2009, the day after promising faster deficit spending to stimulate the economy, Obama called on Obama called on Congress to pass pay-as-you-go legislation, PAYGO, a rule that Speaker Nancy Pelosi has violated a mere $1 trillion since she took power in 2006. Remember what PAYGO was? PAYGO was the idea that you don't have new spending unless you can find spending offsets. They violated that by $1 trillion already. And then President Obama signed his $1 trillion health spending plan and convened his toothless National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform. But the American people have really caught on to what's happening. It talks about how the Gallup poll, stating that the federal debt that the federal government is facing is now tied with terrorism as one of the most worrisome issues facing this country today. And in the latest Pew poll, for the first time ever, more Americans now believe that the president's economic policies have made economic conditions worse than made them better. And Bloomberg reported this week that President Obama's policies are poised to increase the U.S. debt to a level that exceeds the value of the nation's annual economic output, a step that Bloomberg News called a debt supercycle that this country is now facing. Over the past several years, since 2000, spending on social welfare programs has increased by 89%, spending on certain education programs increased by 219%, and other entitlement programs increasing by 81%. Washington will spend $30,543 per household in 2010, $5,000 per household more than just 2 years ago. While some of the spending is a temporary result of the recession, the email points out, President Obama's latest budget would replace this temporary spending with permanent new programs. Consequently, by 2020, a time of assumed peace and prosperity, Washington would still spend nearly $36,000 per household. That's compared to $25,000 per household before the recession. So, putting it in perspective, what does it mean? We had a record deficit last year, $1.4 trillion. This year we're headed to $1.5 trillion, another record deficit. By 2015, the overall debt, not just including the publicly held debt, will exceed well over $15 trillion. Bloomberg News also pointed out some reports that have stated that if you look at the publicly held debt could exceed the gross domestic product in a matter of a mere few years. The debt supercycle is real. And if we don't stop it, it will collapse this country and prevent any kind of economic recovery from ever taking place and taking hold in this country. You know, there's a simple way to get out of this debt supercycle. There's a very simple way, and it means we stop spending and we reduce spending. If we were to simply reduce spending to the level of the pre-recessionary spending levels, we could balance the budget as early as 2019 without increasing a single dime of taxes or increasing fees. We can balance the budget and get back to fiscal sanity in this country by doing what we know we can all do. And that is by controlling the uncontrolled spending in Washington, D.C. I want to talk a little bit, too, about the Heritage Foundation. I encourage everybody to go look at a report that was done by the Heritage Foundation called Federal Spending Numbers, Federal Spending by the Numbers in 2010. And this really does an incredible job of outlining some of the spending that has taken place in this country over the